The room was silent. Not because anyone had been told to be quiet, but because no one could believe what they had just seen. A gorilla had just signed the words, "I love you." Not trained, not prompted, not rewarded. She looked directly at her caregiver, paused, and signed it again. Slowly, deliberately, with intention. Scientists froze, skeptics had no explanation, and the woman standing in front of her began to cry, because this wasn't supposed to be possible. For decades, humans believed language belonged to us alone, that animals could mimic sounds but never understand meaning, never feel deeply enough to express something as complex as love. But this gorilla was about to challenge everything we thought we knew about intelligence, about emotion, about consciousness itself. Her name was Koko, and her story would force the world to confront an uncomfortable question. If a gorilla can feel love, can express grief, can understand loss, then what else have we been wrong about? The air in the research trailer was thick with the scent of pine and the hum of early morning electronics. Dr. Penny Patterson sat across from a 300-pound Western lowland gorilla, expecting a routine session of naming objects. But the atmosphere shifted. Koko wasn't looking at the flashcards, she was looking at Penny. In a movement so fluid it seemed human, Koko's large calloused fingers formed the sign for love, followed by the sign for you. The researchers in the back of the room stopped mid-sentence, their pens hovering over their clipboards. This wasn't just a breakthrough in linguistics, it was a fracture in the wall between species. For years, the scientific community had maintained a rigid barrier. Humans think, animals react. Humans feel, animals instinctually survive. But the look in Koko's eyes wasn't one of hunger or survival, it was one of recognition. How did a creature, often depicted in movies as a mindless beast of the jungle, learn to articulate the most profound human emotion? The mystery began to ripple outward, far beyond the confines of the experimental trailer in California. The cameras were rolling, capturing a moment that would soon ignite a global firestorm. Scientists began to scramble to review the footage, looking for cues or accidents, but they found none. Koko's eyes remained locked on Penny's throughout the entire gesture. If this wasn't a fluke, it meant that for centuries we had been living alongside silent neighbors whose inner lives were as deep as our own. The question wasn't just how she learned to sign, but what she had been trying to tell us all along. For the first time, the specimen had become the teacher, and the humans were the ones struggling to grasp the curriculum. As the news broke, the public's fascination reached a fever pitch, but so did the suspicion. To believe Koko meant what she signed was to admit that gorillas were more than just animals. They were people in different bodies. That realization carried a heavy moral weight. If they were people, how could we justify the cages? How could we justify the loss of their habitats? Koko's 3 simple signs, love, you, and the silent pause between them, had effectively put the entire human race on trial. The room remained silent that morning, but the echo of those signs was about to become a roar that the world could no longer ignore. Koko wasn't born in the wild forests of Africa. She was born in 1971 at the San Francisco Zoo during a cold, grey July. From the start, she was different from the other infants in the primate house. While other infant gorillas were clingy, reactive, and prone to the chaotic energy of their species, Koko was observant. Her eyes, amber and piercing, seemed to track the world with a disturbing level of focus. She was a failure by zoo standards, fragile and needing hand-rearing after her mother failed to bond with her. But she was a miracle in the making. She was gentle, possessing a strange, inherent kindness that defied the King Kong stereotypes. When she was handed a mirror for the first time, she didn't attack it or display aggression like most primates. Instead, she studied her own reflection, touching her nose, her ears, and her teeth, as if realizing, for the first time, this is me. This self-awareness was the first spark, the foundational block of what would become a revolution in animal psychology. While the world saw a captive animal, Penny Pattison saw a mind waiting for a bridge. Coco's uniqueness lay in her temperament. She was a gorilla who seemed to prefer the company of thoughts over the rough-and-tumble play of her peers. She would spend hours staring at the patterns of shadows on her enclosure wall, or gently turning a plastic toy over in her hands as if inspecting its construction. She was a silent observer in a loud world, a being trapped in a body that had no vocal cords for speech, but a heart that was already overflowing with a need to connect. As she grew, she began to mimic the gestures of her keepers, but not in the way a parrot mimics speech. She used gestures to get attention, to point out things she found interesting, and to express frustration when she was misunderstood. Penny noticed that Coco wasn't just acting out of instinct, she was attempting to negotiate with the humans around her. She was a bridge waiting to be built, a linguistic pioneer who didn't even have a language yet. The zoo staff saw her as a beautiful attraction, but Penny saw her as a person. It was this singular belief that Coco was an individual with a unique personality that allowed the project to begin. Coco was the perfect candidate for a radical experiment because she was already reaching out. She just needed someone to reach back and teach her the signs to turn her silence into a voice. The 1970s was an era of radical ideas, but few were as controversial as the Project Coco proposal. Penny Pattison, then a graduate student at Stanford, wanted to do the impossible: teach a gorilla American Sign Language, ASL. The scientific establishment laughed. "It's like teaching a rock to sing," one critic famously said. They argued that primate brains lacked the language organ necessary for syntax and abstract thought. They believed that language was the final frontier that separated humans from the beasts, and to suggest otherwise was seen as heresy. Despite the mockery and the lack of traditional funding, Penny moved into a trailer with Coco, embarking on a 24/7 immersion project. The stakes were high, not just for Penny's career, but for the fate of all great apes. If Coco could learn to communicate, it would prove they were persons, deserving of rights and protection. If she failed, she would be sent back to a zoo or a laboratory, her potential forever silenced, and the door to animal consciousness would be slammed shut for another generation. The experiment was grueling. Thousands of hours were spent molding Coco's hands into signs. Penny lived in a state of constant exhaustion, fueled by the belief that Coco was more than a subject, she was a partner. They started with basic signs like eat and drink, molding Coco's hands over and over until the muscle memory took hold. Critics claimed it was mere operant conditioning, that Coco was just moving her hands to get a reward, no different than a rat pressing a lever for a pellet. But Penny noticed something the critics didn't. Coco began to sign to herself when she thought no one was looking. She would sit in her corner with a picture book and sign the names of the animals she saw. This wasn't for a reward, this was for her own satisfaction. She was internalizing the language. Most expected failure within months, assuming Coco would only learn to ape movements for food. They didn't realize they were about to open a door that could never be closed. Penny and Coco became a team against the world, two individuals from different species trying to invent a common ground. The project moved from a university basement to a wooded sanctuary as Coco's vocabulary began to explode, threatening to dismantle the very definition of what it meant to be human. The first breakthrough happened with a simple request: drink. When Coco successfully signaled her thirst without being prompted, the trailer felt like it had been struck by lightning. But it didn't stop at physical needs. Within a year, Coco's vocabulary expanded to more: food and out. Then she began to do something truly startling. She began to describe how she felt. She would sign happy when given a treat, or sad when Penny had to leave. Most incredibly, she began to do what scientists call productivity, combining signs to create new meanings for things she didn't have words for. When she didn't know the word for a ring, she signed finger bracelet. When she saw a swan, she signed water bird. These weren't mimicry, they were creative linguistic feats. She was using the tools Penny gave her to map out her own world. The audience of researchers began to believe. This wasn't just a gorilla following cues, this was a mind beginning to narrate its own existence. Coco was no longer just a gorilla, she was a conversationalist. Every morning she would greet Penny with a flurry of signs, eager to share her dreams, describing dark and scary images she saw while sleeping, and her desires for specific toys or companions. The wall was crumbling, and for the first time in history, a non-human was telling us what it was like to be them. The complexity of her signs grew to include concepts of time, such as yesterday and tomorrow, which suggested she could remember the past and anticipate the future, traits previously thought to be exclusive to humans. She began to use signs to lie, jokingly signing that someone else had made a mess in her trailer when it was clearly her. This use of displacement and deception proved her mind was working on a level far beyond simple stimulus response. Coco was becoming a bridge between the wild and the civilized, using a human language to express a gorilla's soul. As her vocabulary surpassed 300 signs, the world sat up and listened. The first words had been spoken, and they were an invitation to look deeper into the eyes of every living creature on Earth. As Coco's fame grew, so did the vitriol from the academic community. Skeptics, led by linguistic heavyweights like Noam Chomsky and Herbert Terrace, accused Penny of the clever Hans effect, unconsciously cueing Coco to give the right answers through subtle body language or eye contact. They called the project a pious fraud, claiming Coco was just a highly conditioned performer who had no idea what the signs actually meant. Media headlines swung from genius ape to elaborate hoax in a matter of weeks. The pressure on Penny and Coco was immense. Funding was threatened by major scientific foundations, and critics demanded Coco be removed from Penny's care to be tested in objective lab settings where she would be isolated from her mother figure. They argued that Penny's emotional bond with Coco poisoned the data. The world began to doubt. Was Coco truly thinking, or were we just seeing what we wanted to see? This conflict escalated to a fever pitch, with Penny fighting legal and professional battles to keep her life's work alive. Coco, sensitive to the tension, began to sign frown and trouble whenever the critics visited. She could feel the world turning against them, even if she couldn't understand the academic jargon. The scientists claimed Coco didn't use grammar, so it wasn't real language. Penny countered that a human toddler doesn't use perfect grammar either, yet we don't deny their humanity. The backlash was a reflection of human ego. If Coco truly had a language, we were no longer the masters of the universe. We would have to acknowledge that we are just one of many thinking species. To protect their status, the skeptics tried to silence the gorilla. They scrutinized every video frame, looking for a hand signal from Penny, ignoring the hundreds of hours where Coco signed to herself in total isolation. The dream of a bridge between species was being dismantled by the very people who claimed to study intelligence. It was a dark time for the project, and Coco seemed to sense that her voice was being drowned out by the noise of human arrogance. Amidst the cold battles of scientists, Coco's emotional life was unfolding in profound ways. This was the loneliest mind on Earth, too human for the jungle, too gorilla for the city. She lived in a world where she could talk to humans, but no other gorilla understood her. She was a linguistic island. Her most famous bond wasn't with a human, but with a tiny, tailless kitten she chose for her birthday and named All Ball. Coco treated the kitten with a tenderness that was almost painful to watch, cradling the 4-ounce animal in her 300-pound arms and signing soft and baby. She would spend hours grooming the kitten, her massive fingers moving with the precision of a jeweler. She signed that the kitten was her child. When All Ball was tragically killed by a car after escaping the trailer, the world watched with held breath to see if Coco would react. Many skeptics predicted she wouldn't notice or care. But when Penny sat her down and told her the news, Coco retreated to her corner. She signed sleep, cat, and cry. Then, late at night, when she thought she was alone, the cameras caught her letting out a series of hooting whimpers, the specific gorilla sound for mourning and deep distress. She understood death. She understood that her friend was never coming back. This wasn't mimicry, this was raw, unadulterated grief. It proved that her inner world wasn't just about more or food. It was about the heavy, complex weight of love and loss. The grief lasted for months. Coco refused to play and spent much of her time looking at photos of All Ball, signing sad and unattainable. This period of her life became the ultimate rebuttal to the skeptics. You cannot condition grief. You cannot cue an animal to mourn for a lost companion in the middle of the night. She was trapped in a body that couldn't cry tears, but she was grieving with a depth that many humans couldn't match. Coco had shown the world that her heart was just as large as her body and just as easily broken. Then came the climax, the moment that silenced the critics forever. It was a day when no cameras were scheduled for a documentary, and no scientists were there to judge or record. Penny was feeling the weight of the world's doubt, sitting quietly with Coco in the late afternoon sun. The project was under fire, the funding was dry, and the pressure to produce results was suffocating. There were no treats on the table, no reward for a correct answer, and no flashcards in sight. Coco reached out, her massive hand moving through the air with an unusual softness. She touched Penny's face, tracing the lines of worry around her eyes. Then she slowly and deliberately signed, "I love you." It was spontaneous. It was unprompted. It was the ultimate unscripted moment. In that instant, all the debates about syntax, the clever Hans effect, and conditioning vanished. You don't teach a fraud to express affection at the exact moment a human friend needs it. Coco wasn't asking for a grape. She was offering a piece of herself. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the sound of Coco's heavy breathing. Penny began to cry, realizing that despite the bars, the critics, and the biological divide, she was truly being seen by another soul. Coco wasn't just a research subject anymore, she was a person. This was the turning point that redefined animal consciousness for everyone who witnessed it. It was the proof that love is a universal language, needing no vocal cords, only a heart brave enough to send the message across the void. When the researchers finally heard about the moment, even the most hardened among them were moved. This wasn't a linguistic data point, it was a spiritual breakthrough. It proved that Coco's mind was not a mirror reflecting human desires, but a light shining from within. She had used the human tools she had been given to express a truth that exists in all sentient life. The experiment had succeeded beyond Penny's wildest dreams, not because Coco could name a water bird, but because she could feel and share the weight of love. When the footage of Coco's spontaneous signing and her reaction to Allball's death hit the public, the response was an explosion of global empathy. Coco became more than a news story. She became a global icon for the 20th century. She appeared on the cover of National Geographic twice, the first time featuring a photo she had taken of herself in a mirror, a selfie before the word existed. She met celebrities like Robin Williams, who she famously made laugh during his own period of deep depression, and Mr. Rogers. To them, she wasn't an experiment, she was a friend. But the response was more than just fame. People began to question their own relationship with the natural world. If a gorilla could love, how could we keep them in tiny cages? If a gorilla could grieve, how could we destroy their homes for timber and palm oil? Coco became a message from the wild, a living reminder that we are not the only thinkers on this planet. She forced the world to look into the eyes of every animal and wonder, what are they trying to say? The media explosion turned Coco into a symbol of emotional depth, moving her story from a scientific experiment to a moral awakening for millions. Schools began teaching her story, and a new generation of biologists entered the field with the belief that animals had rich inner lives. The backlash from the skeptics didn't stop, but it became background noise to the overwhelming public support. Coco's "I love you" was a call to arms for animal rights activists. She became the face of the Gorilla Foundation, helping to raise millions for the protection of her wild cousins. Her presence in the world acted as a mirror for humanity. She showed us that we have a responsibility to the voices we have ignored for so long. Coco's life proved that communication is the first step toward compassion. By learning to speak to us, she forced us to learn how to listen to her. The world didn't just respond with applause, it responded with a change in consciousness that would eventually lead to greater legal protections for primates across the globe. Coco passed away peacefully in her sleep in 2018 at the age of 46. Her death was mourned by millions, but her legacy is immortal. She never spoke a word aloud, but she told the world more about love than most humans ever do. Her story taught us that intelligence is not defined by the ability to speak, but by the ability to connect. She proved that emotion is not a human invention, it is a biological inheritance we share with all living things. We were wrong about so much. For centuries, we were wrong to think we were alone in our complexity, trapped in our own arrogance. Coco showed us that beneath the fur and the massive muscles was a person, someone who loved flowers, who mourned her friends, who had a sense of humor, and who wanted, above all else, to be understood. Her existence changed the trajectory of science, ethics, and philosophy forever. She was the pioneer who proved that the animal kingdom is actually a kingdom of individuals. As we look at the empty space she left behind, we are left with her final message, that love is the ultimate bridge. Coco's life was a 46-year conversation that bridged the gap between the wild and the human heart. She didn't just learn a language, she taught us a language, the language of shared existence. Her story is a reminder that we must be the stewards of those who cannot speak for themselves, but who feel every bit as deeply as we do. Coco's legacy lives on in every researcher who treats an animal with respect, every child who looks at a gorilla and sees a friend, and every law that recognizes the sentience of non-human beings. She was the gorilla who spoke to the world, and though she is gone, her voice remains. If this story moved you, stay here. There are more souls like Coco whose stories deserve to be heard, and whose voices, though silent, are screaming to be understood. The conversation didn't end with Coco. It's only just beginning, and it's our turn to keep listening.